This is Chapter 8, Part 2, starting at the top of page 55. If the girls had seemed noisy before, it was nothing compared to their entrance to breakfast. They burst through the door, each high-pitched voice shrieking to be heard over the others, and there was an air of holiday that hardly paused for a blessing over the food and that erupted full blast before the echo of the amen died. Lyddie, her feet alternately sloshing about and being pinched by Tryphenia's shoes, determinedly helped Tim serve both large tables. They brought in great platters of fried cod, hash, potato balls, pumpkin, mush with huge pitchers of cream, toast and butter, apple pie, and pitchers of coffee and milk. Lyddie had never seen harvesters eat so much or so noisily, and these were supposed to be ladies. "Hello there," a voice cut through the din. "We didn't really meet." The room was suddenly quiet. "Don't be rude, Betsy," another said. "She was tired last night." Lyddie turned to see who had said this last because it was her idea of a lady's voice. The young woman who had spoken was smiling. "You only came in last night, didn't you, my dear?" Lyddie nodded. "There, don't be shy. We were all new once, even our Betsy." There was a titter from the rest. "I'm Amelia Kate." Her name was aristocratic. Amelia. It suited her. She was almost as pretty as the lady in pink that had come through the inn last year. Her skin was white, and her face and hands long and delicate, and she was respected, or the others wouldn't have stopped chattering when she spoke. "And you?" "Lyddie Worthing. Lyddie Worthing." With a rough finger, she scratched at the tight homespun across her chest. It seemed to Lyddie that the room was full of young women, all well-dressed, all delicate, all beautiful, and she a crow among peacocks. "Vermont, isn't it?" said the one called Betsy, and a few of the others laughed. "What's the matter with Vermont?" The voice had a bare trace of Green Mountain twang. "I'm from near Rutland myself. Where do you hail from, Lyddie?" Lyddie turned to see a girl not much older than herself, but like all the others, whiter of complexion. She had light hair, braided in a crown about her head, and a serious face that a few freckles failed to relieve. Lyddie pulled at her own scraggly brown plaits, grateful when attention shifted and the room was once again filled with chatter. After breakfast, Amelia and the Rutland girl, whose name was Prudence Allen, offered to take her shopping for a proper dress, work apron, shoes, and bonnet. As they were leaving, Mrs. Bedloe pressed something into Amelia's hand, which turned out to be $1 that Mrs. Bedloe claimed was a payment for her roguish brother for damages to Lyddie's clothing on the way. Much to Lyddie's distress, it took all the money she left, including the coachman's $1, to dress her in a manner that satisfied Amelia and Prudence. She was so pained at the waste of money that she couldn't enjoy any of the new things, though she was pressed to wear the shoes home. In her heart she knew that she had never had a better-fitting pair. Even the stiffness that she felt around the toes and the heels and the ankles were simply a reminder that she had on a grand new city boots. When they were broken in, she would be able to walk anywhere in such shoes, even home. Lyddie never quite knew how it was decided, but Mrs. Bedloe told her that evening that she would move her things from the attic and Prudence's room on the third floor But Mrs. Bedloe told her that evening that she would move her things from the attic to Amelia and Prudence's room on the third floor. The other girls might grumble, which indeed they did, being passed over for a choice room by a newcomer. But Amelia had persuaded Mrs. Bedloe that since Lyddie had no relatives or friends in the house, indeed in the city, she needed their particular caring. Mrs. Bedloe, still feeling guilty about her brother, gave in, so Lyddie was moved into a smaller bedroom on the third floor to be with Amelia, Prudence, and the obviously disgruntled Betsy, who, since their previous roommate had gone home to New Hampshire the weeks before, had had the luxury of a bed to herself. 4 to a room was in itself a luxury, as most of the rooms held 6, but even so, there was hardly any space to walk around the 2 double beds, the 2 tiny nightstands, and the various trunks and bandboxes of the inhabitants. There was no place to sit except on the beds, but then on a regular workday there was no leisure time except the less than 3 hours between supper and curfew. Most of the girls spent their short measure of free time down in the parlor, dining room, or out in the town where there were shops and lectures and even dances, all run by honest citizens bent on parting the working girl from their wages. "Now," said Amelia, who was far more conscientious about her duties as caretaker than Lyddie would have wished, "where will you be going to church on the Sabbath?" Lyddie looked up in alarm. Living as far as they had from the village, the Worthens had never even bothered to pay pew rent in the village congregational church. "I hadn't thought to go." Amelia sighed, reminding Lyddie that she was proving a harder case than the older girl had bargained for. "Oh, but you must," she said. "What Amelia means," Betsy said, looking up from her novel, "is that regardless of the state of your immortal soul, the corporation requires regular attendance of all its girls. It makes us look respectable, even those of us who waste our precious minds on novels." "Oh, do behave yourself, Betsy." "Sorry, Amelia, but if I let you carry on about her moral duties when the girl plainly has no notion of them herself, this conversation will last all night." She put down her book and looked Lyddie straight in the face. "They'll probably make you put in an appearance from time to time somewhere. The Methodists don't press girls for pew rent, so if you're short on money, it's best to go there. You have to pay for it in longer sermons, but nonetheless, I always recommend the Methodists to new girls with no particular desire to go anywhere." "Betsy!" "Betsy likes to sound shocking," Prudence explained patiently. "Don't take it to heart." She was brushing out her long blonde hair and looked like a princess in a fairy tale, though her voice was far too matter-of-factly for a storybook. "But how should Lyddie explain it? But ain't Massachusetts a free country?" "Oh, of course, my dear," Amelia said, "but there are rules and regulations here on our civilized establishment. They are meant for our own good, my dear. You'll see." Betsy rolled her eyes and went back to her novel. The next morning, Mrs. Bedloe led Lyddie down the street, past all the corporation boarding houses, to the bridges that led to the factory complex. Between two low brick buildings was a tall wooden fence. The gate of the fence was locked, like a jail yard, but Mrs. Bedloe wasn't deterred. She simply went to a door of one of the low buildings and walked in. Lyddie followed, dragging her feet, for the room they entered was larger than the main floor of Cutler's Tavern, and it was crowded with tables and scriveners' desks. There were a few men working about the huge room, who looked up over her pens and account books as the two women passed, but it was clear that nothing much was being accomplished, even in the counting room, now that the water was too high to drive the mill wheel. Mrs. Bedloe walked straight through the room and out of the door on the opposite side into a courtyard, large enough, it seemed to Lyddie, for the whole of their mountain farm to fit inside. The front gate and low south buildings, the counting house, the office, and the storerooms, as Mrs. Bedloe explained, formed part of the enclosure. The two slightly shorter sides were taller farm structures, the machine shop and repair shops, and across the whole north end of the compound was the cotton mill itself, a gigantic six-story brick building. At one end ran the frame structure of the outdoor staircase, and from the brick face 6 even rows of windows seemed to glower down at her through the gray April drizzle, like so many unfriendly eyes. A bell tower rose from the long roof, making the building seem even taller and more forbidding. "It must seem imposing to a farm girl," Mrs. Bedloe said. Lyddie nodded and tightened her grip on her shawl to keep from trembling. Mrs. Bedloe turned back toward the low south building and knocked on a door marked "Agent." "I've brought you a new girl," she said cheerily to the young man who opened the door, "fresh from the farm and very healthy, as you can see." The young man hardly gave Lyddie a glance, but stepped back and held the door for them to come in. "I'll see if Mr. Graves can spare a minute," he said haughtily. "Those clerks do put on airs," Mrs. Bedloe whispered, but if she was trying to make Lyddie feel more at ease, she failed, nor was the sight of the agent himself any comfort. "Mrs. Bedloe, isn't it?" He was a fat, prosperous-looking man, but without the manner to stand when a middle-aged lady came in to his office. Mrs. Bedloe talked very fast. Her face flushed. Lyddie was sure that the man would turn them both away. He looked barely patient as Mrs. Bedloe rattled on, but in the end he said he would give Lyddie a contract for 1 year. There was a shortage in the weaving room at the moment. Mr. Thurston, the clerk, would give the girl at the Broadside with the regulations for the Concord and arrange for her to have her smalls vaccination the following morning. They were dismissed with a nod, and Mrs. Bedloe punched Lyddie punched Lyddie and prompted her to thank the agent for his kindness. Lyddie's voice could hardly manage a whisper, but it didn't matter. The gentleman wasn't paying any attention. She signed the paper where the clerk pointed, tried to listen carefully to all his warnings about what the contract demanded, and stuffed the broadside that he'd handed into her apron pocket. She would study it tonight. She decided, her heart sinking. She could tell at a glance that it would be almost impossible for her to make out the meaning of such a paper. Oh, if only Charlie were here to read it aloud to her and explain the long words. Factory girls were not supposed to be ignorant, it would seem. It would be several months before she could read with ease the regulations for the boarding house of the Concord Corporation, but she found out the next day that it concealed unpleasant truths. The first of these was the vaccination. Mrs. Bedloe marched her down over to the hospital after dinner, where a doctor cruelly gouged her leg and poured a mysterious liquor directly into the wound. Lyddie was even more distressed when the wound turned into a nasty sore in a few days, but she was only laughed at for her distress and told it was only for her own good. She'd never get the smallpox now, so she should be grateful. Amelia, indeed, was always instructing her to be grateful about things that Lyddie, try as she might, could not summon the least whiff of gratitude over. But finally, when she had been alternatingly shocked and bored for the better part of 2 weeks, the announcement was made at supper that work was to begin again the next day, and Lyddie felt a surge of gratitude that her days of idleness were over. She would be a true factory girl in a few hours' time. Lyddie was mostly disappointed, but perhaps a tiny bit relieved, when Mrs. Bedloe announced that she would take her over to the weaving room after dinner. The large noonday meal must be out of the way and the dishes washed before the housekeeper could spare a moment, she said. Besides, it wouldn't do to be totally worn out the first day. 4 hours would be plenty to start with. The gate was locked. They don't want tardy girls slipping past, Mrs. Bedloe explained. You must always take care here to be here when the bell rings. They entered the factory complex through the counting room, as they had 2 weeks before, but this time it was teeming with men, all dressed like gentlemen. Every head seemed to rise, and every eye looked their way, and despite her new clothes, Lyddie could feel the shame burning through her rough brown cheeks. She ducked her bonneted head and hurried through as fast as she could, almost shoving Mrs. Bedloe in her haste. Once in the yard, she was acutely aware of the thudding. The pulse of the factory boomed through the massive brick wall, and she could feel the vibration of the machinery as they made their way up the shadowy wooden staircase, which clung for dear life to the side of the building. Mrs. Bedloe huffed ahead, stopping more than once to catch her breath on the climb to the 4th floor, and once there she jerked open the door, and the thudding beat exploded into a roar. She gave Lyddie a little push toward the racket. "Mr. Marston is expecting you," she yelled. "He'll see you settled in." And she was gone. This is the end of Chapter 8, Part 2.